Okay, so this is the next to last class. Reverend Elbert will be doing the last class next week on ritual. But tonight we're going to look at ethics, but it's not quite just about law, because ethics ties into other aspects of the religion. So we're going to be looking at ethics and values and worldviews, because they all tie in together. So first thing we need to do is make a distinction between values and laws. Is there a distinction? Values are the underlying principles or virtues that guide a group's ethical life, while the laws are specific applications. Does everyone see the difference between those? Example, love thy neighbor is a value. Thou shalt not kill is a law. Having compassion is a value. Giving alms to the poor, at least in Islam, is a law. Okay? So it's always important to remember that laws sit atop value systems. They don't just sit there by themselves. But now I'm going to get even a little more complicated, because in looking at value systems, it's also necessary to delineate what we call a religion's world view. Since the value systems they incorporate don't stand alone. So if you need the hierarchy, it's worldview, value system, ethics. Okay. Now, I'm sure you're asking, what is a worldview? Well, you should be asking.
What's a worldview?
What's up? Thank you. Essentially, for religion, it's a type of sacred narrative or story that explains the nature and purpose of the human condition in relationship to what I have called the ineffable, or God. Okay? It's a narrative that gives the connection between what it means to be human in relationship with this higher reality, which various religions have different names for. It's thus an attempt to describe in what we'll call mythical terms, and here I don't mean true or false, not myth as true or as false, but the structure that this relationship takes. And its primary purpose is therefore to provide a framework that creates what we call a psycho-spiritual sense of order. Worldview gives order to a person's life. Okay. Or as the well-known scholar of religion, Mircea Eliade, to create cosmos from chaos. The one thing that human beings tend to really have a difficult time with is chaos. There's the desire for order, some sort of systematic meaning to what it means to be alive. Okay. So we're going to go through the various religions now, and I'm going to start with Judaism. I'll look at the worldview, then move to the value system, then to the specific ethical. Okay, so Judaism's worldview can be symbolized or expressed in two terms: the covenant and the chosen people. So let's start with the covenant. In covenant, the Jewish people are seen to have forged a sacred contract with Yahweh, or God. This covenant is believed to have first been made with Abraham, to whom the Jews trace their lineage. It was subsequently believed to have been renewed with Abraham's son Isaac and Abraham's grandson Jacob. A covenant, an agreement, a contract, as it were. The covenant was then extended when Moses was given the 10 Commandments and other laws on Mount Sinai. So, like any contract, it's two-sided. It's a two-sided contract. God promises to guide his chosen people, lead them from bondage, and reward them with land. That's one side of the contract, or the covenant. In return, Yahweh demands righteousness from the people, both in terms of honoring him and keeping his commandments. So the covenant is a basic aspect of Judaism's worldview. The worldview that there is a relationship between the people and Yahweh as seen in this historical covenant. Now, the tumultuous, if you've read much about Jewish history, you know it's very tumultuous. There's continually be a rise and fall, conquest, etc. And this fits very much into this worldview. Because what's one of the answers that's always given when things go wrong? You've broken your side of the covenant. So that's really the power of a worldview, to explain events, to give order to what it sometimes seems like a pretty chaotic, random thing that we call history. So all these worldviews want to give some sort of order. So that's, the covenant is one of the main. The other is the chosen people. This is part of the Jewish worldview. Actually, I was playing golf today with 5 guys. I was the 5th, and I was the only Gentile. And as we teed off, Reverend Mike said, "Well, how does it feel?" I said, a little different. In any case, the chosen people are chosen because they're required to be exemplars. Okay? They're not just chosen because randomly. They have to be exemplars of this relationship between man and God. That's one thing sometimes, well, they're the chosen people. Well, I think Mike said to me, "Damn, we're the chosen people." You know, to be chosen is not necessarily a good thing because it requires a lot of you. So they're given certain rights and favors, but also required to take on a high degree of responsibility. So that's the worldview. Do we get a little bit of a notion? The covenant and the idea of the chosen people. That's their overall view of themselves as a people in relationship to what I call the ineffable. From that follows the central value system. See, so the value system fits into the worldview. And it's found in the following passages from Deuteronomy and Leviticus. "And thou shalt love the Lord thy God," you know this, "with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." That's the central value system, okay, that comes out of the essential worldview. So the covenant and chosen people thus imply a loving relationship, not only between the two parties, man and God, but between individual members of the group, and in more progressive terms, all humanity. Okay? Because the question of who's your neighbor eventually expands. So, underlying principles then. Transcendence of the individual will in the name of a higher will. Okay? There's a higher will than yours if you're a Jew. Okay? And that's the will of God. So, from that, we then get the legal expression. These are the specific laws that follow on from the value system that fit into the worldview, and they're known as the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments, which, when compared with the whole canon of Jewish law, seem rather small. And in fact, technically, they're not given any greater significance than the others, except by tradition. Tradition has said that these are the 10. But if you look at those 10, you realize when the lawyers get a hold of them, there's going to be 10,000. Okay, so we all know what are the examples of some of the laws. Prohibitions against lying, stealing, coveting. I believe Reverend Elbert's going to be giving a whole lecture series on the 10 Commandments in 10 lessons? 10 sermons. That's interesting. 10 Commandments, 10 sermons. Okay. So that's Judaism. You get the picture? Worldview, value system, ethical laws. How about Christianity? Well, Since Christianity developed out of Judaism, it inherited much of the Jewish worldview, the idea of the covenant, but it adds its own interpretations, primarily in terms of concepts of the fall, redemption, and resurrection. These will add as parts of the Christian worldview. So according to Orthodox Christian doctrine, at least from the time of Augustine, which is the 4th century, man's relationship with God is broken when Adam and Eve disobey God in the Garden of Eden. This is then used to explain suffering and death in the world. Again, do you see how that's part of a worldview? We die, we suffer. We might say, why? The worldview gives, as part of what I call the mythical story, the story of the fall. That's why we... Do you see why it's important to have a meaning system? Because it takes away chaos to some degree. People prefer meaning, even if it isn't the best of, than to nothing. Okay? This idea of meaning. It explains suffering and death, and it also explains the situation of women, unfortunately, to some degree for progressive minds. Because in order for this rupture to be healed, therefore, there must be some sort of recompense. So the question is, the rupture, how is this healed? But the worldview tells us that fallen man is incapable of such by himself. God intervenes, sending his Son incarnate to be sacrificed on the cross as part of the healing process. This is part of the traditional Christian world. Now, over time, you're going to get different interpretations of this, some more literal, some more progressive. But overall, that still is the basic idea. And so we call them the narratives of redemption, the stories of redemption. And there are 3 basic redemption or atonement stories that developed within the Christian worldview. The first one, which was actually the earliest, was called the ransom theory. And that is, Satan required a ransom to let mankind free. This has not been, I don't know many people, any theologians that still follow this one, but for quite a while, it was Satan had to be paid off. Then there was what is the penal theory. That is, God demands justice, and Jesus fulfills this justice by paying for mankind's sins. That idea of he sacrificed for us. Then there's the third one, which I think is probably followed by people that are a little more progressive in their theory, called the redemptive theory, where God willingly sacrifices himself out of love for man, as an example, not to be sacrificed in order to just take away the sin. Which one has been dominant historically? The second one, the penal theory. It was held by Abelard, and that's, till fairly recently, has been the most dominant atonement theory. I think the more Abelard, who's mentioned on the right, held for the more progressive, what we would call progressive theory. So that's the atonement. And then there's, of course, resurrection, and that's the final healing, and that's the victory over death. So again, it's a story that explains the human condition in relationship to God and the problems that human beings face and the answers to those problems. That's what all religious worldviews do. They differ in content, but that's their essential, to bring things back somehow to an original state. So how does that affect then the value system? Well, again, Christianity has adopted much from its Jewish inheritance. the acceptance of the foundation principles of love of God and love of neighbor. In Matthew 22, 37, 40, Jesus says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." That's the value system. Right? You have the worldview, and that is the value system that relates to it. However, in Christianity, there's what I would call another, what I call tangential value system running parallel to this one, and that's the one found in the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. And here we find Jesus being an advocate, not only for the economically poor and the ethically righteous, but also for the poor in spirit and the contrite sinners, if you will. So there's the traditional value system, but then you get this thing called the Sermon on the Mount, which challenged some of the old traditional value systems, right? You've heard it said, but I say. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say, love your neighbor as yourself, turn the other cheek. So that adds to part of the value system that becomes part of the Christian value system. And forgiveness seems to become the dominant ethical demand, as found in "Judge not, lest ye be judged." If you are pure and completely fine, you judge. But if you have any little fault, how can you judge? Because if you do, in a sense, you're being hypocritical. So judge not, unless ye be judged. Now, you can get around it a little bit if you're willing to judge yourself, but a lot of people aren't willing to do that. In any case, do you see how that adds a little bit of a different dimension? This Sermon on the Mount value system, if I can call it that. And this value system is directly related to this redemptive worldview. As a fallen being, man is structurally a sinner. Okay? It's called original sin, and you can interpret that in ways you want. It doesn't have to just be because of the fall of Adam. It can be the fact that for some reason we seem to be self-centered. That's a type of original sin. It must follow that his ethical understanding and himself to be aware that we're all in the same boat. Okay? We are all, quote unquote, sinners. We are all not perfect. We all need some sort of help because we can't will it alone. You ever tried to will something that that's really deep down inside and gnawing at you, you know? That's why if you look at the 12-step programs, what's the first principle? I can't will it. I need assistance in some way. And this is part of the value system. Now, this does create tension because then it raises the big question of work and faith, and that's been a big issue throughout Christian history. Am I redeemed by faith or works or a combination thereof? And you get all sorts of different answers to that. But effectively, underneath all that is the sense you can't do it alone. You need help from some higher source. And then, of course, what we get, this question of grace and works. And before we move to I can sort of skip over, but what's the ethical system of Christianity? It's essentially the same as Judaism, 10 Commandments, right? With some additional law. But essentially, these follow on. The ethical system, the 10 Commandments follow on from the value system, which follows on from the worldview. Well, how about Islam? Again, it shares a lot with Judaism in that it views human history as based on a covenant. Islam is based on a covenant with Allah, as they call the ineffable. But Islam sees history as a series of covenants established by numerous prophets, beginning with Adam. And I think we talked about this before, did we? Adam, at least in Christian history, is the fallen figure who is then eventually needs to be redeemed. Adam falls in Islam initially, then he repents, is forgiven, and becomes the first prophet. So there's good news for repentance, that he becomes the first prophet. So he's only the first. And if we're looking at key terms in this Islamic worldview, it's progressive revelation and people of the book. What does progressive mean? Moves forward, right? It's said in Islam, and you probably can't read, although there's 25 prophets just listed there that are mentioned in the Qur'an. Now, the major ones will be singled out, but they're given status of prophets. In other words, this is the notion that God is continually, over time and throughout history, in connection with humanity. It's not just a one-time or two-time event and then he disappears. It's continual and it's progressive. So who are the major prophets? After Adam, well, then we have Moses. Moses is a prophet. We have Jesus as a prophet. And then Muhammad is called the seal of the prophets. But they're all prophets, and at least theoretically are all on the same plane, are all seen to be equal. That's why in Islam you'll never find, well, you never say never, but very hard to ever find anyone condemning Jesus or picturing him in a way that is degrading. Whereas you find the very opposite true, and often in the West with images of Muhammad. So much of the Quran talks about the stories of these various messengers. Like I said, Moses, Jesus are messengers. Yes, Chris?
I always wondered why in Islam, why there's revelation is progressive, and they believe that throughout time, but somehow Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, and as time goes on, there won't be another one.
Yeah.
It seems contradictory.
Yes, and there are those who have argued that some theologians, that there will be another prophet. But I think it's like any tradition. It tends to want to solidify itself and keep itself running. And if you open up that question right away, then you're going to get numerous people claiming to be prophets, and that stirs up the status quo. So, yeah, and then there's always, what does the seal of the prophets mean? And that's when you get into theological discussion, etc. The Baha'is, for example, say that Baha'u'llah is the next prophet, and that the seal of the prophets, as understood traditionally by Islam, is not correct. Yeah. But in any case, but yeah, it's a good question. It's progressive, but this is the end. Progressive, but this is the end. Yeah.
Again, as you look at the prophets, and that's a bit small.
Yeah.
But looking at it, the majority of them are from Scripture.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. You'll find them in Scripture. You remember, Muhammad was, if not well versed in terms of reading Scripture, knowing the stories of Scripture. He traveled along the Hijaz caravan routes, and he came into contact with Christian and Jewish communities, some heretical communities, some that believed things that were not accepted as orthodox in Christianity. For example, the crucifixion. He believed that Jesus was not actually crucified. His spirit was taken up and kept by Allah. But yeah, he had knowledge of these stories. Now, we're told he was illiterate. That's become questioned by a good friend of mine who's a scholar at University of Michigan, who, to be a trader, he wasn't illiterate. It's used as a trope to show the miraculousness of the Qur'an. How could an illiterate person, and that's one of the main arguments that will be used, how could an illiterate person have done this? Again, there's always a difference between how scholars see it and how believers would see that. But yeah, there's been some question of that, at least by scholarship. And then the people of the book, those are the Jews and the Christians, they have a book as proof of their relationship. And then the Quran is initially said to be the book for the Arab people, because they didn't have a book. So this is their book. But those three books then become part of this worldview. And with each revelation, humanity advances in the knowledge of God. That's the idea. And the Quran is the culmination of this process. And did you go out and hear with Ali to hear the Imam out at the mosque? Were you there? And because he pointed this out, and this is what will often be said. It's directly and finally revealed, and there's no room for new additions, which again has been historically challenged. But this is the pure version. The other books got over time contaminated, which is true of any text. But in any case, that's part of the worldview. So the underlying value system that follows from this worldview is based on love of God, or Allah, as in Judaism and Christianity, and often described in terms of purity of heart. That's one of the main value systems of Islam. The second is social justice, really emphasizing social justice, especially as regard the poor, powerless, orphans. Remember, Muhammad himself was, for a period of time, an orphan. The significance of the first, that's love of God, is seen in the concept of jihad, or the greater jihad. Not the jihad of fighting or defending your community, but the internal struggle to purify oneself in the love of God. That's what the greater jihad means in Islam. And that's part of this, to love God, the need to purify yourself in relationship to God. The significance of the latter, which is social justice, can be seen in the following passage from the historian of religion, Karen Armstrong. She writes, "The Quran requires that men and women strive to create a just society where the vulnerable are treated decently. This was the bedrock of the Quranic message. If Muslims seem intolerant to us today, we should realize that they are not always intolerant of rival visions of reality. Instead, they are intolerant of injustice, whether this is committed by one of their own rulers, like Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi of Iran, or by powerful Western countries. The early message of the Quran is simple. It is wrong to stockpile wealth, to build a personal fortune, but good to give alms and distribute the wealth of society." So there's a very power. So sometimes when you read about Islam haranguing against the West, or calling them the devil, because they see this, the opposite of this. They see great social injustice. Now, that doesn't mean there hasn't been social injustice in Islamic communities, but that's the primary message of the Quran and its value system. And if you don't have that, things will fall apart. So, so the spirit of the value system is sometimes seen in what they call the 5 pillars. Can you see what those are? It's emphasis on love of God. It's declaring the faith and daily prayer. That's the love of God value. Emphasis on communal solidarity in fasting and pilgrimage. Yeah, the thing about the fast, or Ramadan, all Muslims around the world are doing it at the same time. You know, it's bringing that community together in action. And then, of course, the pilgrimage, where if you've ever seen pictures of millions of Muslims descending on Mecca. So the legal expression is known as the Sharia, the code of law. This contains the detailed rules of behavior covering all aspects of a Muslim's social life. They follow on from the value system. Like most legal codes, there are prohibitions against murder, theft, adultery. You find all of that in the Qur'an. The thing to realize, there's no one universal Sharia. There have been 4 major legal schools in Islamic history, and they each have their own interpretation of Sharia, from very conservative to, I wouldn't call it progressive, but a little more open than the very conservative view. So it depends what legal school you follow as to which Sharia you will follow.
Does this document continue to be added on to, or is it now codified?
Most of it will come from tradition, what is called, not Quran yet, but Hadith. I think I've mentioned Hadith are the commentaries on Quran, which would take up, you go with this whole row of yeah. And it gets very detailed, yeah, very detailed. But do you see that Sharia follows the value system, follows the worldview. So those are what we call the Semitic religions. You can see similarities in their worldview, right? Now we're going to move to the Hindu worldview. It's based on what is commonly known as the samsara, karma, dharma paradigm. What is samsara? It's a Sanskritic word that means wandering, as well as world wandering, not just your individual wandering. Cyclical change, or more formally, running around in circles. That's the world. It's always running around in circles. That's samsara. It's the wheel of life into which beings are continually born, reborn, keeps going round. That's samsara. Karma is the ancient Indian concept, which actually means action. The direct translation of karma is action, work, or deed, and its effect and consequences. All actions have consequences. Okay? It's quite simple law, spiritual law of cause and effect. And to the principle of cause and effect that makes things go around. Why do things go around? Because we act. And we act based on certain cause and effect patterns. Dharma, which actually is this is the word Hindus use for religion, by the way. Dharma is the term. What is it? There's no one clear translation, so there's a variety of things. In Sanskrit, it comes from the root dh, which means to hold or support. To hold or support, to give foundation to. You see how that would then apply to religion? Why it would be called dharma, would be called religion. It refers to the law that sustains things from your individual life to the universe at large. In the Vedas, it's known as the cosmic order Rita, R-T-A. The cosmos has an order. Individuals have an order. And that's what Dharma is. So, those three together, samsara, karma, dharma, give the foundation of the worldview. That's how Hindus look at the world. There is the cosmic order. Then there's all this nonsense going around, all the phenomena changing, fluctuating. And then there's the law of karma, which causes all these things to happen. That's why they happen. So what's the goal? To get off the wheel. Eventually. To get off this continual cycle, because it is never fulfilling. It is never fulfilling. Eat your ice cream cone. 2 days, no, maybe for Albert, 1 hour later, he wants another one. And then, that's how karma, that's how desire works. That's how samsara works. It tempts you. It says, come, get this. And then you get it, and you're okay for a little while, and then you say, I want some more. And it's continue. And so the eventual idea is to have this somehow stop. It's the other term that's sometimes used for samsara is maya. It's like a magic show. Samsara is kind of like a magic show. You know, things come and then they disappear. It's like the magician. He puts the rabbit out here, but then he makes it disappear. I don't care what you look at. Eventually, it's going to what? Disappear. Everything in samsara disappears eventually. It's like a magic show. Comes out, disappears. Comes out, disappears. So it's things, things aren't necessarily what they seem. When you get attached to form, you're being fooled. Because we buy into form, especially if it's beautiful. But what happens to that form over time? You know, we send them to the old people's home. Yeah? So form is maya. That doesn't mean you can't live in the world, but recognize that if you get attached to samsara, you're stuck. You're just going to keep going round and round and round, and it'll have some negative consequences as well. A lot of suffering, a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, because things change and we want them to be the same. Yeah. In any case, so there are guidelines of how to do this, and they go back to the religious texts, all the way back to the text called the Vedas and the Upanishads, go back as far as 2000 BCE. And then there are numerous Hindu sects who also have their teachings about how to stop this. How to stop this wheel of suffering. And the value system that follows from this worldview places great emphasis on duty and detachment. Duty and detachment. It's summed up in this phrase, which I want you all to remember, Varnashrama Dharma. There's actually 3 terms there, Varna, Ashrama, and Dharma. So what are these? Varna refers to one's caste, to one's social group. Traditionally determines who you would marry, what your occupation was traditionally, who you associated with. This is your core social group. It's your Varna. To follow Varna is to abide by the duties of one's social station in life. You see how this is part of the value system? If the cosmic order is order, society needs to be ordered. And we have to understand our role. So that's Varna. Ashrama refers to the various stages in one's life. Now these are ideal. These are ideal, remember that. Because at different stages in your life, you have different duties. You have different duties. So when you're young, you have your student. That's when you're called a brahmachari, you study. Then when you do that, you become a householder. You get married. You have a family. You follow the guidelines of the family. But at a certain point, you depart from that. The family will have progressed. You will have had children, and they'll be taking. And then you remove yourself to a more quiet abode where you can concentrate on meditation and getting off this wheel. You've played in the wheel, you've done your duty, but now it's time to depart. And you start focusing on that in the last stages. So those are the stages. And then Dharma, in this context, refers to one's religious duties, proper worship of the gods. But do you see how these are all designed to keep some sort of order in a chaotic samsara? Now, ideally, when you act, your karma should be carried out without attachment to the results. Now, that is not easy. You ever played golf and not cared if the ball goes in on the 8th putt? Okay? We like to have the ends, right? We do things because we want some sort of result. Well, this is what the Bhagavad Gita says. Whoever in acting dedicates his actions to the Supreme Spirit and puts aside all selfish interest in their result is untouched by sin, even as the leaf of the lotus is unaffected by the waters. Act, just don't be attached. You act out of duty, not out of self-centered accumulation of whatever, whether it's wealth or prestige or whatever. The truly devoted for the purification of the heart performs actions with their bodies, their minds, their understanding, and their senses, putting away all self-interest. The man who is devoted and not attached to the fruit of his actions obtains tranquility. While he who through desire has attachment for the fruit of action is bound thereby. You ever watch athletes when they lose? They get depressed. They get angry. Why not just play? Just play. That's the idea. You can play in samsara. It will only pull you in if you get attached to it. Now that's a difficult thing to do. And it takes, first of all, an awareness, if that's important, and you think it's truthful, and then trying to practice it. Yeah. But that's the ideal. Attachment creates all our problems. So, then there's the legal expression, which are known as the laws of Manu, which go way back in time, back to the 2nd century BCE. And again, these are the specific actions and laws that you're supposed to, as in any legal system. Okay? But you see, that's the legal, follows from the value system, based on the worldview. Finally, Buddhism, worldview. It inherits the Hindu samsara karma dharma paradigm, just like Christianity inherited a lot of the Jewish worldview. Emphasis is then given to two, what we call existential principles that come out of this paradigm. And they're found in what are known as the Four Noble Truths. First, the universality of suffering. Indeed, this is perhaps Buddhism's foundational idea. And it's expressed in the first noble truth, existence is called dukkha. Now, suffering doesn't have to mean extreme sorrow and pain. That's one form. The more common form of suffering is anxiety and discomfort. Okay? When we're anxious, when we're not comfortable with things, that's a form of suffering. What does it do to us psychologically? Okay? And if you look at what's going on in this country, there's a lot of anxiety, extreme anxiety, sometimes a lot of despair. that's coming out of this sense. So suffering doesn't just have to be, you have a terrible disease and you're hurting. That's suffering. But we all suffer to some degree. We all suffer, if we're honest. We want things to be other than they are, and when they aren't, we get anxious. That's a form of suffering. And that's, Buddhism says, that's how it is. That's the first principle. Now, if you got stuck there, that would not be a good thing. And Buddhism says that you can get beyond that. But why is suffering inevitable from a worldview? If you want things to be stable and everything's changing, you're fighting a losing battle. Yeah. So the second principle is the capability to awaken or become enlightened. Okay. Human beings can transcend suffering by understanding the reasons they suffer and changing their mindset towards samsara accordingly. That is, by recognizing that the desire for permanency, both as regard things in the world and oneself, is the cause of suffering. We suffer because we desire. We want things to be our way. And most of the time, over time, that's not going to happen. Things aren't going to always go our way. But that causes suffering. But you can get beyond that by, at least if you recognize you're suffering because you're attached to that. So how do I end my suffering about that chair? I don't value it. If it comes, it goes. We value things, right? If I have a nice piece of antique art and it's sitting on my table, and I have some friends over and their kid walks over and hits it and it crashes, I get, I put so much attachment in the form of that thing. But what should I realize? What's going to happen to that thing anyway down the line? Okay? So it takes a little bit of a change of view. Things aren't permanent. It doesn't mean you aren't involved in the world, but you recognize the limitations and the attachments to them. So the value system that then comes is a combination of equanimity and compassion. And this is a great story about equanimity. It's an old Chinese story about a Chinese farmer. Once upon a time, there was a Chinese farmer whose horse ran away. That evening, all of his neighbors came round to commiserate. They said, "We are so sorry to hear your horse has run away. This is most unfortunate." The farmer said, "Maybe." The next day, the horse came back, bringing with it 7 wild horses. And that evening, everybody said, "Oh, isn't that lucky? What a great turn of events. You now have 8 horses." The farmer said, "Maybe." The following day, his son tried to break one of the horses, and while riding it was thrown off and broke his leg. The neighbor said, "Oh dear, that's too bad." To which the farmer responded, "Maybe." The next day, the conscription officer came around to conscript people into the army. They rejected his son because he had a broken leg. Again, all the neighbors came around and said, "Isn't that great?" And again, he said, "Maybe." Get the picture? The whole process of nature, or history for that matter, is an integrated process of immense complexity. And it's really impossible, if you're honest, to tell whether anything that happens in it is good or bad, because you never know what the consequences down the line will be. Now, that doesn't mean you don't make momentary judgments, But you also have to recognize that what we think is good at this point may create something very bad down the line, and something that was bad could create something very good. You have to see the whole process. I just finished a book called Fluke, which talks about fluke, the fluke, like a mistake. It's a fluke. It was a fluke. It shouldn't have happened. A contingency, maybe. But that's interesting, because the guy who wrote the book, one of the early stories he tells is that years before, his grandmother killed herself and her 2 children. The father divorced, didn't divorce, later got remarried, and the mother became the author's mother. And he said, when that hit me, when I knew that I exist because of that. Sometimes the connections can get pretty scary. But you've ever heard of the butterfly effect? Anything that happens has some effect on and you never know. So that's why you should have some form of equanimity. Okay? Try not to judge it, because you don't know the long-term results. You don't know the long-term results. Again, this doesn't mean you don't care about things, but you just put it in perspective. You just recognize, I know very little about this universe and how it operates, so how can I judge it as a whole? Okay. And then there's, of course, I got all the LiPo things. Oh, you know who's going to be really upset with me? Mike. Because I wasn't keeping my slides up with the president. It takes him longer to. Sorry, Mike. Sorry. Okay. The other one, of course, is compassion. Buddhism is known for its compassion. The compassion for all beings. Why? Because we're all in the same boat. It's not I suffer or you. We all suffer at some degree. And we're all in that same boat. And I like this. Have compassion for all beings, rich and poor alike. Each has their sufferings. Yes.
That include more than human beings?
Yes.
All beings.
You see, animals suffer. Yeah. Animals suffer. Yeah. Be aware that this suffering is around you, and try and have compassion for that when you can. The ideal is found in what is known as the Bodhisattva. This is in Mahayana Buddhism especially. This is the ultimate ideal in compassion, religiously. It's one of the highest religious ideals that I know. And that's the notion. A Bodhisattva is one who has actually attained nirvana, or release, and can leave this world of samsara behind, but says, no, I'm not going until all of you are coming with me. So the Bodhisattva stays, not historically, but sort of in a spiritual realm, sort of like the saints in Catholicism, and can be called upon to help. Because the Bodhisattva cannot be happy if there's any suffering. Think about that, what that might mean. But this is where actually you get some really interesting dialogue between Buddhists and Christians in the notion of the suffering Savior, and what that means to suffer for all of humanity, to take that suffering upon yourself. Because how could maybe it would be like if it was your family. Could you be happy if you got whatever release but your family is still suffering? Of course not. Well, this is just taking it to, how can we be happy if anything is suffering? Yeah. Chris.
There are a lot of office or little prayers that Bodhisattvas had taught. And one that I like is, as long as earth endures and as long as sentient beings exist, may I too remain
Yeah, may I too remain. Yep. That, and notice sentient beings, not just humans, all sentient beings. This, yeah, and here, yeah, Chris, this is a version of, it's called the Bodhisattva vow. Never will I seek nor receive private, individual salvation. Never will I enter into final peace alone, but forever and everywhere I will live and strive for the redemption of every creature throughout the world from the bonds of conditioned existence. And personally, I see the Christ image in that. It's a very similar thing, expressed in a different sort of symbolism, but that's the essential idea. There's a wonderful book written by, and I forget his name right now, he's an Eastern Orthodox scholar, and it's called That All Will Be Saved.
What was that?
That all will be saved. In the end, all will be saved. Because if that's not the case, it's a failure. Yeah. Okay. The spiritual system that follows is called the Eightfold Path, which gives psychological behavioral guidelines. Example, right action, right livelihood. What does right action mean? Essentially, do no harm. That's the basic value system. Whenever you act, try and ask yourself, am I doing harm? Try to do no harm. Now again, these are ideals. You never live up to these absolutely, but you hold them as ideals. What happens if you give that up as an ideal? So although you can't always do it, you should keep it as an ideal. Right livelihood, finding an occupation that does not require transgression of ideals of love and compassion. You know, if you're, well, I'm not going to name any, but you can probably get the idea. Think of some occupations that end up doing a lot of harm with just the results of what they're doing. And then there's the legal expression, which I don't have to go into because early on they were basically monastic laws, and you can look at these, are like hundreds of these for monks, what they can and cannot do. And then you have your lay systems. They're usually a little more open. Okay, so conclusion. Although these religions have differing worldviews, they all have worldviews. They give emphasis to different virtues and value systems, but they tend to share one thing in common. Namely, the view that life, both individually and socially, can best be navigated from a sense of self-transcendence. When you get out of yourself. Whether it is termed the love of God, the love of neighbor, justice, fruitful action, or do no harm, common thread is evident. And it seems to me this is the hope for interreligious toleration and hopefully appreciation. That's what we all share. The recognition that unless there is something beyond the self, you end up in a pretty dire situation. Because then it's just self versus self. It's the view of Thomas Hobbes. You know, it's all life is violence, and the winner is the one who has the most power. Yeah. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, so some commonalities here. We're talking about, we shouldn't get fixated on optics. We shouldn't care about the outcome. When you go to college, you'd like to get a degree, you'd like your golf ball to go in the hole. This may be the difference between religion and society. We value productivity. Competition is part of that. You could argue that all this productivity makes rises all boats. So it seems like a contradiction.
It's sort of
I know you said you need to look at it in context.
No, but follow the middle path. It's usually the means. You have to live in the world. It just depends if if things get out of balance. Now, all those things are true, but they put us in a pretty dire situation with the ecology, so yeah, it's not that you don't live in the world. Ultimately, you try and you want to go to college, you want to do a good job, but then in the end, you have to say, why am I going to college?
Do no harm.
Yeah, essentially, try and do no harm as best you can, and have some wisdom. Wisdom in what the karmic results of your choices are going to be. And I think as a society, we're finding out that a lot of our decisions, which at one point seemed to have a good part to them, when it gets out of balance, it turns. I'm thinking mainly of the environment. We use the environment for our advantage, but what happens when we exploit it to the point of view that it's going to come back and whack us? Nature has its own results. Plus what it does to us spiritually. I think, Heidegger said that the way we look at rivers these days, most people look at it first, how is that going to be hydroelectric power? We lose the beauty of the river. Just the aesthetic beauty of it. We tend to look at things in terms of how can that benefit me? Yeah. Okay. Now, of course, we have to have some of that, but when that becomes sort of a societal and cultural god, then you're going to get certain results. You're going to get certain results. Hey, Chris?
I think that's why equanimity is such an important value. Because, of course, you want to have a job and make money and pay your bills. That's sensible. But if it's not in kind of balance, where people make more money and care about it more, and all their time is spent on it, and their very life is spent on it, and they're so important, and they follow the stock market, then you're out of balance with what your Taoist system is meant to be.
And also,
which doesn't mean you don't make money to, live and pay your bills.
Also, when you put all your eggs in the basket of success, what happens when you fail? If you don't have something deeper. And sometimes that failure is not any result, it's just contingency. Things can happen, bad things happen. And if everything's based on your success in the world and suddenly your house gets destroyed, are you destroyed? So that's what I think the religious view says. We're part of something bigger. But it takes cultural teaching to get that across. And I think that's what's really sort of lacking in our society today. And I'm not talking about giving specific religions, but this sort of what I call a transcendent view of what a human being is. When you lose that, you're really at the mercy of contingency. Okay, next week, Reverend Albert will finish up, and he'll be doing rituals and practices. Then we will take, about a 3-week break till the beginning of July. And then I'm going to do something completely unreligious, non-historical, non-philosophical. We're going to Australia-mites. And I've got a lot of good pictures and stories. I'm going to show you the Barbie I used to put them on. Yeah, we lived in Australia for 12 years, so we have some good connections down there. So it's a wonderful wonderful place, and so we'll just take those 4 weeks to I'll be sort of your new what's the guy's name? Rick Steves. Rick Steves and the only way we tie it in is they call it God's own country. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks.